In this episode, Dr. Bill Randall explains how we can see our life as a story or a narrative. This perspective can help us to age meaningfully and to better understand and help our fellow human beings in both our professional and personal life. I like to think of the big three just to give a context. We have money and career, we have health, and we have relationships. There are others, but those seem to be three major themes that my good friend Willy Mader, a German psychoanalyst, would say everybody has to have a relationship with those three things as you go through life. So just a quick example, if you're married, that's one way of being involved with that theme. If you're not married, it's another way. If you're never married, these are all ways of responding to that particular theme in our culture. So maybe we could speak a bit about what are some of the ways that we can do something with these changes that take place with our aging. And I know you've written quite a bit about the concept of narrative care, which again is, we are sprinkling some academic concepts here, but then talking about how they apply to each and every one of us on a daily basis. So maybe we could just generally talk a little bit about that area and come to see where it leads us.
Sure. Well, the phrase narrative care has emerged for both of us and for others in our network as a really important concept. When I talk about narrative care, I mean it in a very broad way. There can be, very formal forms of narrative care, like psychotherapy. When you go to talk to a counselor about issues you're dealing with in your life, you tell the therapist, some part of your story, and together you discuss, how to kind of think about those events or those issues differently, kind of do some restoring. So that's a formal version of narrative care. But I also think that sometimes just everyday conversation with a fellow human being where we listen as closely and respectfully as we can is equally valuable as a form of narrative care. Narrative care means caring for someone's story and listening closely for how they're storying their lives and listening for their signature stories, if you will. And I think for me, just to go back up a little bit, in addition to money, career, and relationships, I think meaning is a key term, and we're going to talk about that, I'm sure. And this is where a narrative gerontology perspective really comes into play, because looking at life as stories that we're in the midst of is all about understanding how we make and remake meaning of the events and circumstances of our lives as we change. And I think aging in a meaningful way is extremely important, or aging in a way where we're finding and making more meaning or different types of meaning has been overlooked within our field of gerontology in general, because again, we've so focused on what we call the outside of aging. And you've written about this a lot in your own writings, Gary, about the importance of meaning, the need for meaning. I mean, we have terms like successful aging and healthy aging and active aging and positive aging, but I think with you, I like the term meaningful aging. Perhaps we can talk about that too. But
yeah, I just to emphasize that kind of theme, there are a lot of kind of buzzwords or concepts, different ways of different ways of talking about aging, like successful aging, and it's kind of analogous to, this is my own perspective on brain fitness. Brain fitness and, encouraging us all. I think it's absolutely necessary for us, our mental and physical health. We're learning more and more through neurobiology and neuropsychobiology that it is really important, and that our brains are plastic and can be, we can grow new synapses, and we can change our brain, which it wasn't that long ago that nobody believed that we were stuck with what we had, and it goes downhill, as you said earlier. But now we realize that we can change our brain, develop new connections, and brain fitness in terms of Sudoku or other types of activities, I think, is most welcome. But I also think, tacking on to the notion of meaning, that if we're engaged in an activity that is meaningful to us, has a purpose, it might be even more powerful than other forms of brain fitness. And you don't hear that perspective quite as often. I think maybe I may be wrong about this, but I think scientists and even social scientists and psychologists have difficulty with the concept of meaning. It's always had more of a home in philosophy and perhaps contemplative psychology or areas like that, or psychotherapy, but it doesn't get as much airtime, so to speak, as other forms of those activities. So I like the fact that you brought that up, and I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I wanted just to tack onto your comments about brain fitness, which, as you say, is all well and good. And, the more fit our brains can be through these various activities, all the better. But I sometimes wonder if brain fitness, mental fitness, etc., is a means to an end that we don't ever talk about, or we don't tend to talk about. And I like some language that I've picked up from some other sources. There's a great book you may have heard of, From Aging to Saging, by Rabbi Shachter Shalomi, who talks in one part of that book about the philosophic homework of later life. And I find myself really stuck on that phrase, philosophic homework. You're a philosopher by trade and by training, and I'm not. But I think he means that in a small p kind of sense, that there's work to be done as we get older, the journey inward, if you will. I think, is it Carl Jung that talks about how the morning of life has its own sort of agenda and dynamic, but the afternoon of life is a different kettle of fish, so to speak. And it's preparing for that journey in the second half of life, where issues of meaning become, I think, paramount, whether we acknowledge it or not. And brain fitness is important as a way of helping us to identify sources of meaning in our lives and perhaps also explore our own stories. I mean, I think that one avenue for brain fitness is getting people to talk about their lives in a way where they feel like they're genuinely and caringly being listened to. I mean, I can think back to when I was a minister, going about my afternoon home visitations, sometimes to older parishioners. And it wasn't a good idea for me to visit after lunch, because I always have to have a power snooze after lunch. But I had to keep myself awake somehow for these visits with somebody who was a shut-in, as we would say, and didn't get to talk to too many people. But I found that a strategy that worked really well for me was as I was ushered into the living room, and the minister was always, in my experience, ushered into the living room that nobody lived in, except you took special people like ministers and priests and so forth. So I was ushered into the living room, and while I was waiting for the parishioner to go out into the kitchen and get the tea and the cookies or whatever, I would be frantically looking around the living room at the mantelpiece, and I'd see pictures. I'd see photographs, I'd see paintings, I'd see memorabilia from various parts of that person's life, so that when they came back in with the tea tray, I had some questions for them. So, I noticed that picture up on your mantelpiece. Is that you and your late husband? Well, yes, that's myself and Frank, God rest his soul, and can you tell me the story behind that picture? Well, it was our wedding day, and we just had a big fight and whatever, okay? So, very quickly, that half-hour or one-hour visit becomes a story fest where I'm fascinated. They get energized, and at the end of the afternoon visit, they're shaking my hand with great enthusiasm. Thank you so much. All I did was just sort of ask a few questions and get the stories flowing. So where was I going with that?
Well, encouraging people to tell their stories, and
I think that was juicing that person's brain oftentimes, in the same way that brain fitness.
Yeah, and their brain, perhaps even more than their heart too. Their brain and their heart, because they may be telling you things that are meaningful to them too.
Exactly, and you mentioned earlier about this, the study of the aging brain has revealed some interesting things. I'm thinking of the work of Gene Cohen, who writes about the mature mind and how, and I don't have the science to sort of support this for sure, but that our left and right hemispheres start to cooperate better as we get older. And one result of that is better control of our emotional lives, for one thing, but also an increase in the autobiographical impulse, the desire to tell our story and to pull ourselves together narratively, if you will.
Yeah, and I suspect the telling the story part comes less from the information side of the brain and more from the heart, so to speak, or
exactly.
the two together. So, Bill,